Good morning, everybody. Here's another day. I don't think this video is going to be very long, although I do tend to remember things whenever I start thinking about these situations, and I ramble a little bit, so I hope that doesn't bother you too much. But I got a couple of unusual and kind of funny shop stories here that I wanted to share, and I could stack a lot of these end on end, but I'm just going to tell you these two today. This new Windstar came in with 242 miles on it, and it said it blows the fuses when you use the door locks. In other words, when you operated the door lock. Now this one was outfitted with remote keyless entry, which wasn't unusual. And I gotta say, this was a long time ago, you know, because it was Windstar became Freestar, and you know, blah blah, and so on and so forth. But this is when these vehicles were just about brand new. Windstar was the first vehicle that came out with a gym module, but one way or another. So this, we have a Windstar with keyless entry, and we also have a fuse that blows every time we operate the door locks. Okay, now this is a brand new vehicle. When you got a brand new vehicle that's given a problem like this, you go about looking for the problem a different way than if it's an older vehicle, unless you see where somebody has made modifications like putting running boards on or something like that, you know, if they've done the work themselves, or even if it's been hired done by somebody other than the dealer. Alright, so this was the wiring schematic for this particular system that had the keyless entry on it. You can see the, let's see this, the buttons up here, the 5 buttons that went to the keyless entry module, and basically your switches here would send signals to this module, and this module would then operate the door locks. Now the door lock actuators are down here. You notice there's your remote keyless entry module, and it was what was going to operate the door locks. And so you had your lift gate lock actuator. There's your gym module right there, which was part of the package too. Anti-theft module, which would be, you know, that's the remote anti-theft personality wrap module for it, like they call it on some vehicles. Then you left in your right door actuator. So you had a lift gate. There's also a side door, a sliding door actuator there too, and sliding contacts. This is a memory lock relay. The reason it was there was if you happen to have the sliding door open whenever you lock the doors, and then you ran the sliding door closed, it would basically, the generic electronic module would see that you had locked the doors, and then after you locked the doors had closed the sliding door, and then it would lock the sliding door. Now remember, this was the mid-90s, and this is the kind of electronics that you had even back then. This was the way it would be wired up if it didn't have remote keyless entry in that particular year model. Now you notice on this one here, you had a rear door lock switch, and that was back in the cargo area. And then you had a right front door lock switch and a left front door lock switch. So you had 3 door lock switches on this one, but on the previous one you didn't have but 2. Alright, and like I say, now this changed after the following year, but in this particular year model, here we have this this thing happening. Alright, so there's the switches, and that's what they look like up close. Rear door lock switch, right door lock switch, left door lock switch. There's only 3 door lock switches there, but there's 2 on the one with keyless entry, because in their mind you didn't need one in the rear. Alright, so I'm working on this thing trying to find anything that will cause this, and I've removed the interior trim, and I'm expecting wire harnesses, and I'm just looking for all kinds of stuff, seeing what they might have done during the assembly line process that would have caused this thing to blow fuses. I didn't see any modifications that I could spot. You know, usually if somebody's been tinkering with the wires, you can spot that. Although whenever I did wire harness modifications, I tried to make it look factory as much as I could. Well, Eddie Clark was a Chrysler field rep, and he was there to look at a Grand Cherokee, and the person that was supposed to bring the Grand Cherokee for him to look at hadn't showed up. So Eddie's cooling his heels waiting for the guy to show up. So he came over here because he was a kind of a friend of mine. We'd got acquainted when he'd come there over the, you know, several times. And he was watching me work on this Windstar because it was a brand new platform at the time. And so he said, oh, this is really cool, you know. Again, he was able to just get his eyes on something that wasn't Chrysler, you know. All right, so After 4 hours, I found out the problem I had been chasing was caused by a salesman. This came without a rear switch. It had a little plug in that spot, and the wires were hanging right behind it where you could just plug it into a switch. But they didn't put a switch in there because the Ford people reasoned, well, if you've got a keyless entry, why do you need that switch in the back to lock the doors? And so the person that bought the vehicle told the salesman, how come I don't have a switch back here in the back? How come I've just got a plug and some of these other ones has a switch? The guy said, well, I'll order you a switch and put it in there. So the salesman orders the switch, pops the little cover out, plugs the switch in, and creates a situation so that it will blow the fuse when you operate the door locks, because it was wired slightly different with keyless entry than it was with the, when it didn't have keyless entry. This one had keyless entry. He had put a switch in there that wasn't supposed to be there. It was causing it to blow the fuse. The salesman said nothing to nobody about this, because that's how salesmen usually do. Okay, so here I was scrambling around. 4 solid hours I worked on this thing. Finally figured it out. I don't even remember how I came to that conclusion, but I found out the salesman had done this. Maybe one of the parts guys told me the salesman had ordered a switch. I can't remember. Okay, so here's what we got here. This is how it came from the factory, with that connector dangling behind that little, trim plug. So he pops the trim plug out, he takes his switch, he plugs it in there, and he creates the short. Okay, now this was the way it was without, this one here didn't have the switch. Anyway, I already talked about that, so I ain't gonna hammer that. Well, the service manager, this was the guy that I've talked about before. There was 90 hours a week of drivability work coming in, and I was the only drivability mechanic there for a while, because they specialized me in drivability, because whenever fuel injection was coming to be a thing, there were trucks all up and down the other side of the shop with a new car pre-delivery guy and a couple other guys trying to figure out why they were blowing black smoke and all this kind of hogwash. And so whenever they gave me one to fix, I always got it fixed pretty quick. And so they said, we're going to specialize you on this. And so I was doing nothing but drivability work. And I was the only person there doing it for a pretty good little while. And there was 12, 15 cars a day I had to work out. I'd work out, about a car every 30 to 45 minutes, usually. And when the dispatcher tried to give me something that wasn't drivability, I'd say, now, I don't mind doing this, but you're going to you're going to have a ticket stacking up over here in this other rack. He had a total rack that was dedicated just to drivability problem. Now that's when the work orders were written by hand. They handed them out to you that way, instead of putting them in the computer and sending it out to your terminal or whatever. All right, so here we are, 90 hours a week worth, and I was turning 60, 80 hours a week doing all that work myself. And the service manager hired 2 more drivability guys. He hired one, then he had me train another one, he hired the other guy. Well, there's still only 90 hours a week coming in there. That didn't change, and that left each of us doing about 30 hours a week. So he likes to stack the place full, where, I mean, this guy didn't understand, if whenever he just had 2 of us, we were both turning 45 hours a week. He puts 3 of us in there doing drivability work, specialists. Of course, I had to help the other guys a lot of the time anyway, but one way or another, he calls us in because we're not turning enough hours. He wants to have a talk with us, and I said, well, am I going to get paid for that Windstar? He said, you're not going to get paid for that one. Well, whose fault was that, And I said, Eddie Clark said I'd get paid. Well, Eddie Clark, and that confused him for a minute. He said, Eddie Clark works for Chrysler. He knew Eddie Clark was an authority figure that could get stuff paid, and it confused him that I was working on a Ford and Eddie Clark was there. Anyway, that was funny as all get out. I was just playing a game with him. In another occasion, and we'll ramble for a minute here, there was an Eagle Premier, and there was a little display on the dash that, instead of showing its little numbers and letters like it was supposed to do, that thing was showing gibberish. And so I reached up there and unplugged it and plugged it back in, and it cleaned up its act. And of course, it started doing it again a little bit later, and I said, we're going to have to order this. And so we ordered the part. It was about $100. And this guy was there was a Sony plant back in those days that that made stuff for Sony manufacturing, whatever. right there in town. And this guy was a Japanese guy. He was driving this Eagle Premier, which I thought that was odd. It seemed like they would have given him a, I mean, he bought this car. It was his own car. It wasn't a company car. Seemed like he would have been driving a Toyota or something, because usually Asian people will buy Asian makes, you know, and I'm not trying to be ethnic here, but that's just what I've seen. The lady next door to me, she's German and she drives a Volkswagen. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if I was American and I was living overseas, I'd probably buy an American car if I could. But anyway, the long and the short of it was this, whenever I pulled the dash apart to put the part in there that I had to order, that little electronic part, that Eagle Premier was basically an Americanized R25 Renault, but it was built up in Wisconsin anyway. So I plugged that thing in, got it going, and somehow or another, the little bitty lights behind the Prndl PRNDL thing went out. And I don't know how I could have even made those go out if I wanted to, but some of those things are a little wonky, and if you jiggle them, they'll blow, you know, if they're on when you touch them and all that. But anyway, he came back and said, hey, this little light behind my, of course he was, you know, he was talking with a heavy Japanese accent. This little light behind my PRNDL doesn't work. And so they gave it to another mechanic. The other mechanic pulled it apart and said, hey, it's going to need bulbs, and the, you know, parts of the labor will be $40. Oh man, he threw a fit. He didn't like that. And so next thing you know, me, the service manager, the other mechanic that worked on it, and this Japanese guy are sitting together on the couch in the general manager's office. So we're sitting there next to one another, and this Japanese guy says, we don't have this kind of problem with these cars in Japan. Why should I have to pay for this? And I said, well, you know that little part that I replaced in the dash? He says, yeah. I said, it was made in Japan. And his reaction was so funny. He went, oh, I never seen anybody do that before. We fixed it without charging him, but that was just funny as all get out to me. Whenever he was confused when I told him the part we had to change on this car was made in Japan. Honestly, I don't know if it was or not. I just told him that. But one way or another, he didn't have to pay for that second repair. The 18-year-old boy brings in a Cherokee with 27,000 miles on the clock and an inoperative charging system. Now these ran out of warranty at 24,000 back in these days. And so here I says, okay, I checked the charging system, and I find that the positive post had burned off the alternator because the nut was left loose, probably at the factory, and it just kept arcing until it burned the post off. And the post was actually welded to the terminal, and I actually had to, you know, I said, well, I'm going to have to clip that off, put a new terminal on there one way or another. So I said, okay, so I made the guy a price of $250, you know, we're a dealership, you know. And so I walk up there and I tell him, he's got this girl on his arm that he's walking around with. I guess apparently he just met her. And he wants to impress the girl, so when I say, hey, it's going to cost $250 to replace the alternator, he says, go ahead and fix it. And so the kid's dad was a friend of the general manager, so I was told to borrow the alternator from a new Jeep to get him going. So I had to pull another Jeep in there. It had the same alternator as this one here. And so I had to, on this one here, the way that I did that one, you had to pull the battery out, you had to pull the battery box, you had to just pull this bracket off. All kinds of stuff was in the way to get down to that alternator where it was mounted on the side of the block. And so I had to do this twice. I had to do it on the new vehicle, then I had to do it on his vehicle, and then I put a new terminal on the wire, I mean on the end of the wire, because it was all scorched and burned up. And I actually held on to that initially, or put it in the vehicle or something. I might have put it in the cup holder, I can't remember. But one way or another, got it fixed, got it going, got it charging. Everything was good. Put the bill together. It was exactly what we said it was going to be. I said 250. It was probably 253 or something like that. Okay, so granted, I could have pulled the alternator apart and rebuilt it, and I've done that kind of thing before. But in this particular case, this is how we handled it, you know. So when it's time to pay the bill, the girl's gone. The kid's standing at the cashier's window to pick up the vehicle. Says he doesn't have the money. He apparently said go ahead earlier, putting on a show for that girl. And he was only like 18 years old anyway, and his dad was out of town. And so I was told to swap the alternators back out. So I had to do that work again. I had to pull the alternator off of the one I had put on there off. I had to put it back on the new vehicle, and then I had to put his crummy alternator back on his vehicle, and that kind of thing. All right, so I said, well, this is, you know, double work for no pay. So factory tighten the bolts, because I was a little bit ticked off. Well, Sammy found this air tool behind the seat of an new F-150. I've mentioned it before on one of my videos. I traded him out of this thing. I actually went to the tool truck, because I said, you know, this thing had a little ring gear and a pinion up here in the top, and it had this big, strong, powerful air motor, and I wanted to know if I could buy one of these new. So I went to the tool truck, and I saw on there on the housing it said Stanley. It was a Stanley air tool. And I said, well, I'll be able to get one of these. So I went to the tool truck, the Mac tool truck guy, and he looked and found out that he could order me one of these, or one very similar to it, and it was like $3,000. I'm not kidding. I thought, well, I ain't gonna do that. Well, the gears in the head would have been 95 bucks if I wanted those, because the gears were kind of starting to wear out, and one of them had a chipped tooth, but it still worked really good. When you pull the trigger on that thing and hit the end of its travel, it would just about jerk your arm off. Man, this thing was super strong. Well, I used that thing to tighten the alternator bolts because I was kind of mad, you know, and boy, I tightened the crap out of those things when I put the original alternator back on. Alright, so the next day the kid's dad took the Jeep to an alternator shop. They rebuilt the alternator. The alternator shop tried to convince the guy we had never touched the vehicle, probably because the bolts were so tight. Never mind the fact that I had soldered a new terminal on that wire, and the old scorch terminal was laying in the cup holder. So his dad came with the general manager to confront me. So I looked him in the eye and I told him the truth. I replaced the alternator. I did it twice, and I did it for free. See, this guy didn't really have anything to complain about anyway, because we didn't charge him anything. That kid came and left and didn't pay he didn't even pay a diagnostic fee. Probably because his dad was a friend of the general manager. I don't know. But the lesson here, the general manager walked away with this frustrated guy, and I overheard him saying, I'm not going to question that mechanic because he always tells the truth. I thought that was a really, you know, good thing to hear the general manager say, because I had, you know, had a lot of conversations with him, and he would come and get me when he wanted me to investigate something and find out what the truth was. You know, I've talked about that a time or two as well. The lesson was always tell the truth, and your yes or no will be enough. You don't have to say, I swear, or none of that kind of stuff. All you got to do is say yes, and you stop right there. And because you've always told the truth, you know, if you ever don't tell the truth one time, they ever catch you in a lie one time, then, you know, whenever it's something that's going to get you out of trouble or whatever, then you're going to wind up in hot water when when it's your word against somebody else's. You know, I told that to my two boys. I said, you always need to make sure, when I was raising them, they're in their 40s now, that you always need to make sure you're telling the truth, because you want to be able to say yes or no, and that be enough, without having to, you know, try to up your game by saying, I swear, this is the truth, you know. That's the end of that story. We've only been here 18 minutes. Maybe some of you guys lasted all the way through this one. But I really have a good time telling these stories. I will be back next week, and I appreciate you guys listening. Subscribe, share it with your friends, or just enjoy it yourself. Anyway, see you next week.